Good evening and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. My name is David Wood, an events manager at Northshire Bookstore with locations in Manchester, Vermont and Saratoga Springs, New York. At any point this evening, please type any questions for our authors in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. I'll save those up for you and pose them towards the end of tonight's event. And finally, before I introduce our authors, a note of thanks. Independent bookselling is a hard job in the best of times, and these last few years have been other than that. Northshire owes its continued existence to your support, and we are so grateful. Now, I've been looking forward to tonight for a long time. It's my great pleasure to introduce two authors tonight. Rupert Christiansen for his new book, Diaghilev's Empire, How the Ballets Russes Enthralled the World, and Lynn Garafola for her new book, Nijinska, Choreographer of the Modern. Rupert, self-confessed incurable ballettoman, is the dance critic for The Spectator. He was also dance critic for the Mail on Sunday from 1995 to 2020, and has written on dance-focused subjects for many publications in the UK, the United States, including Vogue, Vanity Fair, Harper's and Queen, The Observer, The Daily Telegraph, Literary Review, and elsewhere. He was an opera critic and an arts correspondent for the Daily Telegraph from 1996 to 2020, and is the author of a dozen nonfiction books, including Romantic Affinities and City of Light. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 1997. His new book, Diaghilev's Empire, How the Ballets Russes Enthralled the World, has been called a deliciously entertaining account of high art, low cunning, and one of the most creative episodes in the history of the arts. While the Times said he writes about his subject with such descriptive flair and affectionate animation that its very essence leaps off the page. You can order it from Northshire at the link in the chat. And I should have been holding this up the whole time. Lynn Garafola is Professor Emerita of Dance at Barnard College, Columbia University. A dance historian and critic, she's the author of Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, a wonderful book, and Legacies of 20th Century Dance, and the editor of several books, including The Ballets Russes and Its World. She's curated several exhibitions, including Dance for a 50 Years in New York City Ballet, New York Story, Jerome Robbins and His World, Diaghilev's Theater of Marvels, The Ballets Russes and Its Aftermath, and most recently, Arthur Mitchell, Harlem's ballet trailblazer. Nijinska, Choreographer of the Modern, has been called an astonishing achievement, an epic tale, and a book all choreographers were waiting for. And the LA Review of Books said Nijinska could not have hoped for a more sympathetic and conscientious biographer. She understands the physical, educational, visual, dramatic, political, interpersonal, and financial aspects of the dance industry from the inside out. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Rupert Christiansen and Lynn Garafola. Thank you both so much for coming. Let's get started. Rupert, could you please start sort of by just positioning your title? What brought you to Diaghilev, and maybe a little bit about what brought Diaghilev to ballet?
Sorry, what brought me to Diaghilev, did you say?
What brought you to Diaghilev, your
yes.
background, and what brought Diaghilev?
There's an odd history to this book, really, because it wasn't a book I wanted to write at all. I wanted to write a book called After the Ballets Russes, because a certain person who is in the room now, whose Christian name is Lynn, had done all the groundwork, and I thought I had nothing else to say about the actual Diaghilev era between 1909 and 1929. But I was interested to write about, to try and bring together what happened after Diaghilev died, between the 1930s and the 1970s. All these people who tried to imitate what he'd done and emulate it and follow on, and largely they failed. But my publisher said, sorry, nobody's going to buy a book called After the Ballets Russes. Please try and tell the whole story. So, you know, I went with the money and signed up for this absolutely crazy project. Then halfway through my research, COVID struck and everything closed down. So, on the other hand, I did actually manage to get the book finished. So that's the history. That's how it came to pass. That's how the book came to pass.
Thank you. Thank you, Rupert. We lost you there for a minute from your internet, but I think it's all right.
Oh,
All
sorry.
right,
Yeah.
so no
Yeah.
problem. So this is the perfect question for you both then. So Diaghilev was an impresario. His friend and collaborator, Alexandre Benoit, said he was not a creative genius. He was perhaps rather lacking in creative imagination, but he had one characteristic, one ability, which none of us had and which made of him what he later became. He knew how to will a thing. Could you both sort of elaborate on that and talk a little bit about this story, this amazing story?
Lynn.
Well, Diaghilev certainly had a will, and he certainly had a tenacity and a almost stubbornness that if he wanted to do something, he would find a way to do it. Although there were times when, unlike some people I've written about, he was willing to stand back and say, all right, maybe we should try something else. In other words, accepting the inevitable. But I think Diaghilev did actually have a certain creative dimension, which Benoit really didn't want to recognize because there was a kind of sibling rivalry between Benoit and Diaghilev that began at a very early time in the early 1890s when Diaghilev, almost like a country bumpkin, comes to St. Petersburg from Perm, and there's Alexandre Benoit and his friends. They're lively and sophisticated, and they know all about the imperial theaters. I think Diaghilev had the ability to imagine works, to imagine how things could come together. He also had the ability to listen, as I think Prokofiev said, to a piece of music and on the first listening, and to understand what was really original about it and what was that glimmer of genius in something that perhaps was not a work of genius, but had that glimmer of genius in it, and then how to develop that. And I think that's a creative, that's pretty creative. Maybe we would call it being a creative producer, which is a term I sometimes like to use for him, rather than an impresario, sorry, which sounds like Saul Hurok. And Diaghilev was not Saul Hurok.
Absolutely. Would you agree, though, Lynn, that there was a certain element of hit and miss in his taste? That people always remember the great successes because there were a lot of flops.
Yes.
His taste wasn't impeccable, were there? There were mistakes that he made.
I mean, I would agree that, first of all, there were definitely flops, and there were things where perhaps he didn't quite gauge how it would go over. He didn't quite gauge what would come in. He wasn't always working with known components, which makes it easier then to judge what you're doing. And also, I think he became at times a little bit like a machine. Okay, we have a new season, we have to have 3 or 4 new works, and maybe you don't have something of genius coming, in the pipeline, but we have to put something together. And some of those things that he managed to put together with a professional veneer, everyone was well rehearsed, lights were done, costumes were made, most bills were paid. That was done, but they weren't necessarily works of genius.
Would you agree with Richard Buckle, a British dance critic, who said that he thought Diaghilev's finest moment was, and in fact, I think he says it was the greatest bit of talent spotting in history, was finding Massine, who had done almost nothing when Diaghilev picked him up, in the way that Nijinska was known and Karsavina were known quantities. Fokim was a known quantity. Massine was nothing.
Well, I don't know that I would say that it's the greatest instance of his genius, but it certainly was an example of that ability to sense talent and sense a talent that could be developed, because it's not only, I think, that Massine did have talent, but that he was willing to be molded by Diaghilev. And that, I think, was crucial to his development as an artist.
Yeah. And then, of course, at the end of his life, he had this similar infatuation, didn't he, with Igor Markovich, a young composer who was 16, and took him into his bed and gave him also all sorts of chances. But that one came to nothing.
Although he
really,
gave
did
Markovich
it?
a career. He launched Markovich on a career. He
Yeah,
had become a well-known conductor, um, you know, etc. He married Kira Nijinsky, Nijinsky's daughter, keeping things within the family. But I think Markovich did go on to a career thanks in large part to Diaghilev's connections and the way he had been launched.
yes. I don't want to do Diaghilev down in any way, because I mean, of course, I absolutely agree with you. He's stunning. I think sometimes I'd like to, you say creative producer, I'd like to very briefly in my book to those great gallerists of the early 20th century, like Kahnweiler and Vollard, who commissioned Picasso and Cézanne, and so who invested in them early and reap the rewards.
Yes, I think that's an interesting comparison, because the thing about those gallerists is that they really did see the glimmer of genius, more than a glimmer in the case of someone like Picasso, but nevertheless, they were going against the tide. They saw something that and were willing to stick with it. And
yeah,
even through the war, when some of them actually lost quite a bit of money when they had to repatriate, because many of them were actually German born and it was very complicated. The one difference, though, is that apart from the stuff that Diaghilev had accumulated around time, along the, throughout the years, Diaghilev didn't leave a fortune. After all, if he had had more Picassos,
yes,
his estate would have been worth a great deal more.
I don't know what happened to the book
But
collection.
I think that's a very interesting comparison.
Yeah.
The book
Do you know
collection?
what happened? Did Lifar
Yes,
pinch it all? Yeah.
Yes, Lifar pinched it all, and then he had a sale in Monte Carlo in 1974 or thereabouts, maybe it was 75, and they printed a, it was through Sotheby's, but in Monte Carlo, I assume to avoid French taxes, and it was published. Now, at some point, I interviewed a librarian who, in 1975, around the time this book collection came up for sale, I had been at Harvard, and he told me how thrilled all the Slavic librarians and bibliophiles were, because this was a great collection that Diaghilev had built. It included some of the very earliest printed books in Russian, as well as certain journals that were extraordinarily rare. So I believe that something like, maybe 20% of the books were, of the materials ended up at Harvard, although they don't have a Diaghilev collection. So you can say these are all came from that sale.
Yes.
Many books ended up there.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Do you think if he'd lived another 10 years, that he could have, do you think he could have kept it up, is what I was going to say, for another 10 years? Or do you think there was a slight falling off of interest and inspiration in those last years? I mean, he was accused, wasn't he, in the mid-20s of being just in love with the next smart thing just for the sake of it?
That's a good question, but I'm not altogether sure. I think some of it would have depended on his health. After all, he was suffering from untreated diabetes, and he did like chocolate and champagne, which wasn't good for it. And I do think there were things that were interesting him. I mean, after all, he was very interested in Prodigal Son, in the ballet, and in the dancers who were in it, like not only Lifar, but also Anton Dolin, who had returned to the company. He loved the fact that Alicia Markova, or Alicia Marks from North London, was becoming a real ballerina. He had taken her on when she was like 13 or 14 years old and groomed her, brought her along, and now he wanted to revive Giselle for her. Now, Giselle was her great role. We know that. She did it everywhere. And that, I think he would have found some things to interest him. And he also had the idea that things shifted, that nothing remained the same, that in 1930 he would not be doing Parade or Scheherazade again, that those things belonged to past eras. And I think that part of him that really was kind of eternally young, if you will, was able to appreciate those very different changes. But how his health would have lasted, I don't know.
Well, it's what if, isn't it? It's a counterfactual question. But it does fascinate me in the light of the way that things fell apart after he died. You know, the whole art of ballet seemed to disintegrate in 1929. And for some years, it's there was this sense almost that ballet was going to die.
Well, I don't actually agree with that line of argument, because I don't think an art form dies. I think it goes through a lot of different phases, and that in that moment of the mid 1920s till about the late 1930s, there were numerous groups that called themselves the Ballets Russes de so-and-so, of Menchina, of Bronislava Nijinska, of this one, of that one, of de Basile, later of Serge Diaghilev. But there were many English companies that were beginning to spread their wings and training dancers. So I think it was actually an interesting period, the early 1930s, before historiography and certain writers, such as Arnold Haskell, simply said that the de Basile company, this is a company that was led by someone named Colonel de Basile, that wasn't his real name, but in any event, that the company that he led was the heir to the Ballets Russes, and it absolutely wasn't. There were some wonderful dancers who came out of came from many different places. Many of them were children of emigres. They had either been born in the West or had come when they were 2 years old, were trained, many of them by former imperial ballerinas teaching in studios in Paris and elsewhere. But the creative spark, that creative imagination that I think Diaghilev brought to his Ballets Russes, wasn't there. And he really was after the marketplace. Those long tours that he subjected his dancers to in the United States, those whistle stop tours that went on for 5 and 6 months, those poor dancers.
Yeah. I suppose what I meant really was that after Diaghilev dies, there's a loss of focus, as you say. It is that there are all these extraordinary experiments in London and in America and all over Europe, but they're all relatively small scale until de Basile comes along, and then there is a sort of focus. But then, of course, that disintegrates by the end of the 30s, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
in the middle of this.
I think these international companies had their moment. This was another thing that we should emphasize, that in the 1920s and 30s, many of these ballet companies were full of dancers from all kinds of backgrounds. I was always amazed writing about Nijinska how many American dancers she worked with. She barely spoke English, but she was working with all of these American dancers while she was still in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. Anna Ludmila, who was from Chicago, Meriwether was her name. Someone else who was her Ophelia when she did Hamlet in 1934. Another one, I think she was also from Chicago. So, she would have these companies were very international. When she worked for the Ida Rubinstein Company, they came from all kinds of backgrounds, including Ashton and Chappell, who came over from London. Who would imagine that so this wonderful meeting ground of young ballet talents emanating from these centers. But you're right, it wasn't until the national companies became really important, such as the Royal Ballet, Sadler's Wells, and the Royal Ballet in England after the Second World War, that the national companies basically took over from these.
And of course, what you don't get, I suppose, after the early 30s is you don't get any more Russian dance. There's that extraordinary wave of talent that comes over
Right.
to Paris and then London and then America between 1917 and about 1930. And that dries up really until until Nureyev and Makarova and Baryshnikov come back.
Well, I think the big shock was when the Bolshoi went to London, where the Bolshoi went to London in 1956.
Yeah.
Jaws dropped.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the first time the Bolshoi
only came for a few weeks. The troubles only came for a few weeks, and then they went back.
But there was a fabulous movie that was made of it.
Oh God, Ulanova. That film of Ulanova's Giselle is just something else for me. Wonderful.
And then the Kirov came, and
Yes.
and then as you say, Nureyev defects, and he becomes a really important figure in this demo. But suddenly, what does this do to the old Russians? They're not, what are they teaching? They're teaching Russian technique, but here are Russians who say, oh, we have Russian technique, we have Vaganova technique. And what is this version of something that they're dancing? We have the real version. It was very interesting how these ideas of Russianness begin to clash and contradict one another, and also to harmonize a little bit.
Yes, fascinating. And of course, now there's been another diaspora, I suppose, in the last few years with all Russian dancers, since the war in Ukraine, of course, some of them leaving Russia altogether. But dancers like Diana Vishneva and Zakharova in Milan and Vishneva in New York, half in New York, half in Moscow. I mean, I wonder what that does to style. Whether they've is Vishneva now an American dancer, or does she remain a Vaganova dancer?
Well, dancers can have multiple personalities, and sometimes it depends on the works they choose to do. Someone like Diana Vishneva was really interesting because she decided she didn't only want to do what she had learned at the Kirov Mariinsky company, but she ventured into all kinds of places, I think for the most part interesting places. Some of the dancers venture into places that I don't find quite so interesting, like Osipova. I think she's made some funny decisions, and and others basically go abroad and they want to do the same thing they always did before. They want to be big Russian ballerina. Yes.
Yes. Can I ask you a little bit about your fabulous book on Nijinska?
Mm-hmm.
How many of her ballets did you actually manage to see? I mean, apart from Les Biches and Les Noces, which exist in, as it were, authentic versions. I think Le Train Bleu has been reconstructed, but is possibly doesn't bear much resemblance.
I would say what is, with something like the Train Bleu, what is the most real is, or one might say the most authentic, are the costumes and sets, and the wonderful drop curtain by Picasso. And I think that gives it its feeling of 20s-ness. I think some of the acrobatics may be, something that's real, but I don't think much of it. For me, it's a little too cute. And Nijinska did have a sense of humor, but she certainly wasn't cute. And I think that is the person who reconstructed it. who, by the way, claimed to have
Yeah.
notes and have spoken and worked with Anton Dolin. So his sources seem to be fairly good. I do know that Irina Nijinska was called in only at the end, and she did a few things, but she had never seen the ballet because Irina, in 1924, when the ballet was done, Irina was all of 11 years old. I don't think she was ever in the studio with her mother, so she never would have seen it choreographed. And if she saw a performance, she perhaps saw one performance. And then subsequently, her mother left the company. I've seen bits of Chopin Concerto. I've seen bits, which is one of the ones she did for the Polish ballet. I've seen
Which is still in the repertory or just film? Is
Just
Chopin
film.
Concerto still in their repertory or just
No,
film?
it is not in the repertory. Unfortunately, it's not in the repertory. And that's, I feel, really tragic because it could have remained in repertory. Nijinska said it on this last company she had in Buffalo, New York in the late 1960s. So those people are alive and well.
Yeah.
Many of them pursued ballet careers, so they understand what staging something is. They were advanced dancers. They adored Nijinska, worked with her on several ballets. And as in the early 1990s, Irina Nijinska, Nijinska's daughter, tried to pull some people together to revise it, but she only used her friend who was in the 1930 version when it was first done, and maybe a revival in the early 40s. She wanted nothing to do with the Buffalo people. So when a few of the Buffalo people came by and looked at this, they said, well, everything seems different. I entered over here, the entry, most basic things, entries, musicality, to say nothing of steps, were totally different. So then Irina died and nothing happened. And I feel that was really lost.
Nothing was notated.
The only bits of Chopin Concerto were notated. However, they were very rough. It was the very rough sketch of the notation. And since the person who notated it, who actually was doing it in Benesh, she was English for the Buffalo company, had, I think she went back to England. So she wasn't around the next time they performed it. So she would then refine her score. So there was never a worked up score. I spoke to her about whether anything was possible to retrieve. She said no.
Nothing.
There's also a reconstruction which Irina and a few of her friends, again old timers, did of Bolero for the Oakland Ballet. But again, for some reason, they didn't ask or work with, say, someone like Maria Tolchief, who had been danced it in the 1940s.
Yeah. Very
so
sad.
One sees all of these things sort of dissolving.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is the tantalizing and very, very charming dances in Reinhardt's film A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yes,
we can see, but of course that's sort of light entertainment, really, isn't it?
Well, it's as close as Nijinska would get to light entertainment.
Yes, yes. The one of course I would really, really love to have seen is Hamlet. Could you talk a little bit about that ballet? About
Hamlet? Oh my goodness. Well, Nijinska decided to do a Hamlet, and like Sarah Bernhardt and other actresses before her, she decided to be Hamlet. And there are some very tantalizing reviews of it, of her performance in it. Some things that, that she seemed to be beyond gender, beyond male or female. This sort of tragic figure. She also did some very interesting things with staging. She was working with Yuri Annenkov, who was a Russian emigre artist, but who, like her, absorbed a certain amount of the Soviet avant-garde styles. And so this didn't actually have a back curtain. Um, it had kind of curtains that many of which were almost, you could almost see through. And so the lights did interesting things. And there was one moment where Ophelia dies, and a number of critics described this, where there was fabric moving up and down, and then suddenly behind this fabric, Ophelia disappears. And this actually reminds me a little bit of something in The King and I, where, and also Alvin Alien Revelations, it's a great idea.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Oh, fascinating. Yes.
Yeah.
And the other one I'm very interested by, because it was a great hit in its time, is Sans Baiser, 100 Kisses.
Yes,
I think that
100 Kisses.
Battle. Yeah, and Baronova, I think, was the star
Yes.
of that, wasn't she? Yeah.
She loved Baronova, and she really struck up one of those relationships that Nijinska had with wonderful ballerinas, from Alicia Markova, Rosella Hightower, and especially Maria Tolchev, where they would just play around with steps and movement and rhythms and things. And suddenly these women were doing the most complicated things they never imagined they could do. And it was wonderful for the audience. No one could replace them. So when Baronova left and they tried to put Riobushinska in her role, she just couldn't do that kind of technical virtuoso things that Nijinska had really molded to her and to her personality. And later she worked with her with ballet theater, and La Fille Magardée, which was another wonderful production that Nijinska did, and which remained in repertory for many years at ABT. In fact, someone who danced it in the 1950s said she remembered a whole lot of her dancing and could, teach it. So another avenue to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm.
Now tell me about Richard Buckle. We were talking a bit before about Richard Buckle, who was a very influential man in what you might call, they might call in university Diaghilev studies, or in the Diaghilev world.
He was a very, very fascinating character. I did spend a whole day with him. His Balanchine biography, which is not the best thing he ever wrote, I think, and has certainly been,
but not uninteresting.
But I mean, will be Jennifer Homan's new biography is obviously going to supersede. And he was very, very truculent, very difficult. I think he had a should we say, a bad relationship with drink, which was his worst enemy. But he was, he was a proper ballettomane, wasn't he? He absolutely was in love with that art and devoted to it in the most disinterested way. And he established this magazine, Ballet, just before the war, and then started up again after the war. And that lasted a few years. And then he became a very influential ballet critic for both the Sunday Times and the Observer in London. And I think he was a critic in a way that Arnold Haskell wasn't really. Arnold Haskell, I always think, he was a historian and almost like a sort of camp follower, but I don't think he was a great critic. Would you say that was fair?
Well, I think he was a cheerleader, especially when it came to the de Basile company.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and was sort of infatuated with the ballerinas. But he was sort of, he was loose cannon, Buckle, and he made it a huge number of enemies. And his performance was very erratic, I think. If you go back and read him week by week, sometimes I think he wrote his copy when he was drunk. Sometimes it's absolutely brilliant. You know, he enormously admired the great New York critic of the day, Edwin Denby.
Yes.
And I think he rather emulated Denby. You know, he wanted to be as poetic as Denby was, but he was a very, very different sort of personality. He was always falling downstairs and shouting at people and having these disastrous love affairs with very, very unsuitable young men who ended up robbing him. And, you know, it was a mess of a life, but a wonderful mess, you know, a sort of brilliant mess. And of course, he wrote two great biographies of Nijinsky and Diaghilev, where he managed to talk to all the survivors. And I'm sure you'd agree, they are hugely, with all their flaws, they are hugely important books.
Yes, I would agree, because he did do the research. He did, or I should say, he did a great deal of research on those books. So his book about Nijinsky, which as a book, I believe, holds together a little better. It's an easier, it's a more fluid read. Of course, Nijinsky's life was much shorter. I think he was also rather brave, I think, in talking about his relationship with Diaghilev, Nijinsky's relationship with Diaghilev. And that he published that book in 1972, 73. So this is very early on in the era of gay liberation. I think the Diaghilev book defeated him because he had so much information that it just overwhelmed him. And his publisher, I guess, insisted he cut some, but he couldn't because it was so overwhelming.
Yes.
And
sorry, I think the 70,000 words that he cut are in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I would love to read them, but unfortunately that archive is closed at the moment, so I never managed to get to it. Have you? You haven't read it?
No, I haven't.
Uncut version.
No, I haven't read the uncut version.
Yes.
He had to. It was Alexander Bland, wasn't it, who did the cutting, who did the editing?
Absolutely. I suppose sorry.
Even apart from the books he wrote, there were those amazing exhibitions that he.
And the exhibitions, of course, the 1954, the Great Diaghilev exhibition, which, you know, quite apart from what it told people about the Ballets Russes, really revolutionized the way people presented art exhibitions, much in this very theatrical way. Ninette de Valois sniffed and said it was like Madame Tussauds, the wax, you know, it was the waxwork. She didn't think Diaghilev would have liked it at all. Hundreds of thousands of people went to that exhibition. Loved it.
And it really sparked interest again in the Diaghilev Ballet Russe, not the, you know, the Ballet Russe before the recent Ballet Russe.
Yeah.
And then also those wonderful, when they discovered the costumes, these costume caches, or caches of costumes, went on, Diaghilev costumes went on sale at Sotheby's in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was instrumental in getting many of them to museums.
Yes, absolutely. And then now, and they occasionally they will pull one out, but they're very, very fragile. And one of the problems is that dancers, the sweat that dancers produced is ingrained in the costume, and you can't dry clean them because they would just crumble. Rather poignant, but they're so beautiful.
The ideal costume. The ideal costume for an exhibition is one that comes from a ballet that was pretty much a failure. So it was performed 3 times.
Or only once.
Or only once.
Yes.
And the costumes.
But he was quite frightening, Richard Buckle. Well, I found him quite frightening because he made it very, very clear that he knew, he knew everything and I knew nothing. But I was in awe. I'm glad I met him for all that.
And you used, I noticed in your book, you found interviews, or the original interviews that Mr. Buckle had conducted with various Ballet Russe people, and they're now in Austin at the University of Texas Ransom Center.
Yes. All his correspondence with Lydia Sokolova, who was English. In fact, her real name was Hilda Munnings, and he was very close to her and ghosted her wonderful autobiography, which I think is a very, very, I don't know what you think, but I think it's a very reliable source for the Ballet Russe years. And anyway, all his correspondence with her is in the library in Austin, and it's well worth going through. It's fascinating.
How did they work together? How did they work together?
Mostly by letter, but she lived in Sevenoaks, which is a small town only about 30 minutes from central London, and she would come in on the train. She was completely forgotten in her old age. She married a bank clerk and lived in a tiny little cottage in this village. And, for 20 years, nobody paid her any attention at all. And Buckle was the one who saw her value and was an enormous admirer of her thought she was the most wonderful person, apart from anything else. Yeah. But she's rather more candid in the letters than she
then it comes across
what got into the book. She's rather guarded in the book. Yeah.
Yes, well, also,
we,
it's another time. That was published when? About 1960?
About 1960, I think. Yes. Yeah.
So it's another.
I've just seen there are 6 people waiting to ask. Are they waiting to ask us questions?
Well, there is one question already from the audience. Remember, the other one was if it's being recorded, and I said yes, we're recording it. It'll be on YouTube tomorrow. But the question is from Carol, and she says, "Where should we look in the dance world today if we want to see the most lasting influences of Diaghilev?"
Oh, that's an interesting question. Lynn, what do you think?
I think someone like Alexei Ratmansky. I think he's someone who has developed as a choreographer, who holds choreography to be something, an instrument of self-expression, as something that's important. He tries to use interesting music. Often it's Russian music, sometimes contemporary music. He has, he works with different designers. I don't always like everything he does, and I don't always like his choice of designers, but I think he's got a vision and an obsession with ballet, an intellectual and artistic obsession with ballet and ballet's languages that Diaghilev would appreciate. I think Diaghilev would love to talk to him. I also feel when I go to New York City Ballet, I'm seeing certain remnants of that early, of the late Diaghilev period. I mean, after all, Apollo and Prodigal Son, which were 2 of Diaghilev's very late ballets, which were choreographed by Balanchine, are in the New York City Ballet repertory. In the case of Apollo, looking very, very different. But in the case of Prodigal Son in particular, one has a sense of what a Diaghilev production looked like when the curtain goes up and you see a drop curtain. It's by Rouault. The audience still, this is New York City Ballet audience, it's seen it a million times. They always kind of go, this little, in the audience, you know, seeing that. And again, the creativeness, and to remember that this was a new score and this was a new choreography at the time. And even if some of it seems kind of silly, like those little gnomes who stamp about, nevertheless, I have a sense of something that Diaghilev might have done. Well, he did do it.
And of course, we at the Royal Ballet, we have Les Noces still, which Nijinska herself gave to the company in 1966, and which they perform every 2 or 3 years. I'm hoping that they are going to perform it next year. Yes, I mean, they
It's
must.
not on this schedule yet. Not on this schedule.
But you know, because the dancers need to learn how to get that vocabulary into their bodies. But it's still I still find it utterly thrilling and almost shocking every time I see it, even though I now know it very, very well. It still seems to me blazingly modern and different. You know, I think one of the great masterpieces of the 20th century, not just balletic, you know, of any art, in any art form. I think it stands up. The other, I'm a great fan of Ratmansky's. The other figure in London, I don't think he's as well known in New York as he is over here, is Wayne McGregor. He is a choreographer who has his own company. He commissions, he also works with the Royal Ballet, and he's worked with most of the major companies in the world. He's very, very productive. But he also has this talent for bringing together composers. You know, he commissions composers and designers in a way that I suppose is, I've never asked him whether he is inspired by Diaghilev, but I suppose at some point he must be.
It's also interesting to think of some of the moderns, you know, a certain generation in the 1980s, like Trisha Brown and others, who were trying all kinds of combinations of contemporary music and contemporary art, and of course their own contemporary dance forms. So you see the desire to bring these different elements together, but the look is of course very different from a Diaghilev production. But nevertheless, I think it comes from a similar kind of impulse to create a total theater work.
Yes.
It's certainly difficult for some companies to do this, especially when there's not a great deal of money behind them, because commissioning scores means you have to pay living composers. One of the contracts I found that Nijinska had signed with American Ballet Theatre in the early 1950s specifies that the music she chooses, she can choose any music she wants, but it has to be music that is out of copyright, because they didn't want to have to spend royalties. They didn't want to, they had no money to commission. And big commissions require a lot of money. And of course, for ballet companies with large numbers of dancers, they require a lot of rehearsal. I mean, this is one of the reasons I think that Les Noces is not done as much as it is, because it has a very big cast, it requires unison a lot of the time.
A lot of rehearsal. And musicians. Yeah.
The musicians, 4 concert pianists, all of the percussion, and singers.
Yes. The interesting thing, though, we've mentioned 2 choreographers, 2 figures, Ratmansky and McGregor. Of course, the difference there is that they are both choreographers, and Diaghilev had no aspiration to choreograph at all, did he? I mean, the only thing he was really interested in was lighting, which I think he did have some real creative input into.
Yes, he certainly wasn't a choreographer, but I think he understood the centrality of choreography to ballet. And I think that's one of the things he taught his audiences, because on a Diaghilev program, which was usually a mixed bill, where you had generally 3 works, sometimes by 3 different choreographers, you could see the same dancers entering the imaginative universes of 3 different choreographic artists. And that was one of the things about Diaghilev that was quite wonderful, that he never completely threw out the old stuff. He would keep the good old ballets, he kept Firebird and Petrushka in repertory and Les Sylphides in repertory, even as he got rid of a lot of other stuff. And he also kept the best of Massine's ballets in repertory and Nijinska's ballets. The one ballet he didn't keep in repertory was Nijinski's Rite of Spring, which I think he could have, but in any event, that's another question.
Oh, I suppose that was forgotten during the war, though, wasn't it? Because it was 1913, wasn't it? And
Yes.
then they only did about 6 performances. They did very, very few performances. And then I suppose Massine, there was Massine raring to go and do it
Yes,
better.
Massine was raring to go, but Nijinska said when she got back to work, when she was working for the Ballets Russes from 1921 to 1920, almost 1925, that she said she could restore Nijinsky's version, but I guess they had the other version, so they, why spend all the time rehearsing yet another version, etc. But one of the things I discovered was that Nijinska, despite the fact that she never said a word about it, had actually danced the Chosen Virgin.
Yes, of course she had, yeah.
In Massine's version.
Yeah.
There were certain things she never talked about.
There's a question here from Tracy that I think is it's a good. We're almost out of time, unfortunately, but it's a good way to kind of do this, and I think it rings true with some of our viewers in Manchester, Vermont. She says it's rather broad. If you live outside the areas to see live dance and ballet programs, where could you go? What's the best? What's kind of venue for that? She says she knows that the Marquis and Royal Opera House have streaming options, but what do you all both suggest?
YouTube. I think YouTube is really important. I'm finding more and more stuff on YouTube that I never, ever would have thought I would find. People are just putting things on. And there are some things that are sold on, CD, on DVDs, although increasingly people are just, as I say, putting things on YouTube. And I'm astonished by it. If not an entire work, then maybe 10 minutes of a work. It used to be at one time, if you wanted to see a recent Balanchine ballet, you might get 20 seconds. Even now, they're allowing, the Balanchine Trust is allowing older versions to be put on YouTube, so you can see things from the 1970s and 1950s, maybe not what they did last year, but nevertheless, there's just a lot more. So I think ballet people are a big component, well, probably not a big component of the audience for YouTube, but I think we're an important audience.
I quite agree. I find I can spend hours rootling around on YouTube, and you can find fascinating little fragments. There's one wonderful one I've found of a fabulous ballerina of the mid-1930s, Tatiana Rabutchinska, doing the Bluebird pas de deux from Sleeping Beauty. It's I think the only record of her. It's absolutely magical.
Yes.
Because people just don't dance like that anymore.
No. I mean, it is amazing to see that we're able, thanks to film and recordings and video, to see how performance has changed so much over 70, 80, 90 years. It's, I mean, you can admire this Briaboshinska thing. No one today would dance like that, but it's still utterly admirable, admirable.
Yeah, and even closer to us than that, I found a recording of Fontaine doing Margot Fonteyn doing the Rose Adagio from Sleeping Beauty, I think in about 1960. Absolutely gorgeous, but nobody dances it like that now.
No.
It's the same choreography, but the style is completely different. Her whole idea of how to phrase it, completely different.
Yes, the musicality, and of course,
Yeah.
all the bodies are so different. So many bodies are so much taller. They're much more, in a way, muscular, and the extensions are so high.
So high, the Vishneva, you know, legs going up to.
Yes, the Zaharova, the Sylvie. But of course, all
Very
of these
well.
people had their amazing
Yeah.
styles, personal styles.
Yeah. I was fascinated reading the memoirs of the Diaghilev ballerinas, how much they ate in those days, you know, and how much time they seemed to spend in restaurants. Savana was very interested in food, became a very, very good cook. And if you look at that, there's little fragments of films of her, she was really almost chubby. And they had fat legs in a way that no ballerina today would have.
No.
Chubby little calves.
Well, remember that the beauty in a ballerina follows beauty in high society. And what was,
Yes,
you know, the beauty around 1900 was
it's quite
the hourglass was a little bit, you know, was quite
buxom.
different.
Yes.
And then by the 1920s, we have the slimmed down Charleston look, and the ballerinas in the Ballet Russe were looking a little bit different from Karsavina and that first generation. And but I also think with some of the ballerinas of the 1930s, those Russian emigre children, many of them had grown up without too much food. And I think that food was important, and it had a symbolic, and many of them were sending money home to their families. So as they were touring around, they were sending money home to help put food on the table. So there was glamour, but there was also this underside, because the 1930s was, of course, the Great Depression.
Yes. I talked to Leslie Caron, who worked with Roland Petit just after the war in Paris, you know, and she said we lived off coffee and cigarettes. And at the end of a day's rehearsal, I would faint because I hadn't had, there was nothing to eat. I hadn't had anything to eat.
Yes.
Yeah.
But of course, there was also something else. I remember reading some things about the Marquis de Cuevas company, and there was all this talk about how the dancers were losing weight and getting thinner. And one of them was Leslie Caron. She's come back from Hollywood and she's looking so much slimmer and more glamorous. And then Marjorie Tallchief, oh, she's getting so thin. And she just had twins. But all of this emphasis on thinness, which made me think of Balanchine, but I had always thought that it was Balanchine sui generis. But it seems to have been something that was more connected to fashion in the 50s and 60s, and not just Balanchine's own
well, yes, I mean, he didn't like his ballerinas having babies or going out for nice dinners, did he?
No, he certainly didn't like them having babies, but you know, some of them did.
Yes, yeah, good
Allegra had 3.
Yes.
Lynn, Rupert, this has been an absolute delight. I'm sorry that we are out of time, but it has been an absolute pleasure getting to host you and listen to you this evening. And you can order their books at northshire.com. Diaghilev's Empire, How the Ballet Russe Enthralled the World, and Lynn's La Nijinska, Choreographer of the Modern. Lynn, Rupert, thank you so much for such an enjoyable evening.
Well, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Have a great evening, and we'll see you at another Northshire Presents virtual event soon. Take care.